Good morning. Welcome to Woodlands. It's great to have you worship with us today. I hope you're enjoying the nice summer as I am. You know, if you've been a Christ follower for very long at all, you know that there are 6 words that every Christ follower wants to hear. You don't have to read the Bible many times to see these 6 words kind of jump out at the pages, from the pages of Scripture at you, and to kind of resonate in your soul. If you're serious about your relationship with Jesus, these 6 words are what you want to hear. And they are, when you get to the end of your life and you stand before Christ, you want to hear him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Well done, good and faithful servant. You want him to look you in the eye and to assess your life and to say, "You lived it in a way that honored me. Well done, good and faithful servant." I don't know what else he'll say. He'll probably say things like, "It was difficult, it was hard. I asked you to walk through some difficult waters, but well done, good and faithful servant." Paul the Apostle described his thought on his life as he got to the end of his life in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where he said these words. He said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. And there is now laid up for me in the future the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all those who have loved his appearing." We're going to think this morning about taking steps of action that enable us to get to the end of our lives and hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." What kind of action steps? Because getting to the end of our lives and hearing those words is the end product of thousands, no millions of decisions that we're going to face over the course of our lifetime. So we want to think about taking action to be honoring to Christ. We're in a series today, a second week of a series that we've been doing through the book of Nehemiah. And that series is called Building a Legacy. And in this series, we're talking about building a legacy. Again, legacy here, not a monument to ourselves, but rather the fruit of our lives, the footprint of what we do, what we leave behind. We want that to be honoring to God. And we're using as our study material, of course, the book of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah, as I mentioned last week as we introduced this series, was a man who understood this. He was a man whom God used to build a legacy for the nation of Israel. But he understood right at the outset that what he was doing with his life mattered, as all of our lives matter. What we do with our lives matter to God. And he gives us assignments, he gives us a calling, and he asks us to build a legacy with our lives that honors him. So this morning we're going to look at how to do that. We left Nehemiah, if you remember, at the end of chapter 1 praying. Nehemiah had just heard that the city of Jerusalem, his home, was in ruins. It had not been rebuilt like he had hoped that it would have been rebuilt after a long exile. And so he goes to God, and for 4 months he's praying. For 4 long months he's praying, and we have his prayer. We looked at it last week in chapter 1, and the end of that prayer ended with, "God, give me success today before this man." Now, when you read that prayer and you know that it's a 4-month prayer, you have to do an interpretative choice. Is he about to tell us that the one day that he said today, the answer came, which is you're going to see the answer in chapter 2, or was he praying that prayer every day for 4 months? I'm of that latter persuasion. I'm of the persuasion that Nehemiah, this cupbearer to the king, this one who had a daily, or if not daily, frequent audience to the king, was praying, "God, today, let it be today. Maybe it's today. God, give me success. Give me favor in the eyes of this man." And for 4 months, that prayer was not answered, but it's about to be answered. So let's watch and see what God does and then learn from Nehemiah's example. What's going to arise today for us are 2 lessons from the book of Nehemiah about how we can take action to build a legacy that honors God. So Nehemiah chapter 2, follow along in your Bibles. And again, if you don't have them, please bring them each week, because these are big chapters and we can't put it all on screens for you. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. "It came about in the month Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes that wine was before the king." He's a cupbearer. He tests the wine. "I took up the wine and I gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence." That's very important. "So the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart.' Then I was very much afraid. And I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed with fire? Let's stop and analyze this a little bit, what's going on here. He makes a point of saying, I've not been sad in the king's presence. Why does he say that? Because it's bad form to be sad in the king's presence. It's bad protocol. You don't do that in those days. You were supposed to have a happy face before the king at all times. You're supposed to communicate that the very best, how could I not be happy, O king, because I get to serve you. And so you don't show any emotion or sadness. That's just what you did. And if you did show sadness in the presence of a king, especially one who was the greatest king at that point in human history on the earth, Artaxerxes had more power. The Persian Empire was the dominant empire. If you did show sadness, it was an affront to the king. It could have been perceived that way. It could have been perceived as, what, you're not happy to be here? Where else would you possibly rather be than in my presence? And so, of course, Nehemiah didn't show sadness. That's bad form. That's protocol. That's what you do. But today he does. Was it intentional? Was it a change of strategy to try and get the king to say something? I doubt it, personally. I don't think that was the case. I think when Nehemiah had prayed, God, give me success before this man, I think Nehemiah knew, because he was a good Jewish lad, good Jewish man, he knew Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1, which says this: the king's heart, even the king's heart, is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. He knew that God had turned the heart of Artaxerxes' predecessor, Cyrus, to issue a decree to build Jerusalem. He knew that God could do this. So I think what he was praying all those months was, God, give me an opening. Maybe have him say, maybe the king will say, Nehemiah, you've been a good servant. Is there anything I can do for you? Maybe that's how he imagined that would play out. But maybe after 4 months, Nehemiah got kind of tired of compartmentalizing his sadness over Jerusalem. And maybe it showed on his face. The reason I think that's how it played out is because Nehemiah's reaction said, I was very much afraid. He doesn't say I was nervous. I was a little afraid. It's an incredibly strong statement. Why was he so incredibly afraid when he was before Nehemiah, or before Artaxerxes? Well, for 3 reasons. One, because Artaxerxes was this incredibly powerful king, and he had the right to dispose of people or get rid of people whenever he wanted to. And if you messed up in his presence, without a heartbeat, you could be removed, either banished or executed. So it's not a small thing to not follow protocol in the presence of a king. So when Artaxerxes calls him, you're sad. This is sadness of heart. What is this? Of course he's very much afraid. This man has the right to do with Nehemiah's life whatever he wants to do. And Nehemiah would have heard of of servants before the kings who didn't win the king's favor and were eliminated. In our day and age, when a president has to get rid of somebody, right? Like president gets rid of a secretary of state or a chief of staff, usually they ask for their resignation because they don't want all the press. But if they have to fire somebody, they fire somebody. But whether they ask for their resignation or whether they fire him, what's going to happen to a president when he gets rid of a key leader? He's going to get lambasted in the press, because we live in a free society and we can talk about things like that. And even though it might be a great decision, leaders know that when they make hard decisions, they're going to get blasted. Artaxerxes had no such fear. Not an iota of that fear. If he didn't like the way one of his servants lived, he got rid of him. And if someone didn't like the way he got rid of the last one, he'd get rid of him too. You didn't argue with Artaxerxes. So Nehemiah is very much afraid. The second reason he's very much afraid is because in his request, look at it, verse 3. He said, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been burned with fire? You know what Nehemiah just did in that statement? He's saying, there's something more important to me than serving you. Whoa. Remember last week I said Nehemiah was going to take a huge risk. This is it. in saying that, he's basically saying, there's something that affects my heart that makes me sad, even though I get to serve you, O king. And that is that the land of my birth is, the city of my birth where my fathers lie entombed is in shambles. That's a pretty big risk. The third risk is even greater because he's about to ask Artaxerxes to let him go and rebuild it. And when he said, Jerusalem lies in ruins, you know how it got there? It got there by decree of Artaxerxes. Because when Ezra had gone before Nehemiah to rebuild the temple, and Zerubbabel had gone, and the wall started to be rebuilt, some people opposed the rebuilding of the wall. And they went to Artaxerxes, and they said to him, if this city is rebuilt, it will rebel against you. And so Artaxerxes, is found in Ezra chapter 4, Artaxerxes issued a decree, stop the rebuilding of the wall. Nehemiah is about to ask for an official change of policy. And he's saying to the king, in essence, I want you to change what you've done because what you've done has made me sad. Boy, talk about a risk. This is a risk. You bet he's very much afraid. You bet he's very much afraid. That's what's going on in these first three verses. It kind of reminds you, if you know your Bible, reminds me a little bit of Esther. If you want to get a sense of how you entered the presence of a king, remember the story of Esther. Esther is that great book of the Bible where God is never mentioned once in the book of Esther, but he's everywhere in its pages. And Esther comes to power, and there's a great threat. You remember the story about there's a great threat against the Jews, and Mordecai, Esther's relative, said, maybe Esther, God has put you in this place for this moment to save your people. Maybe, Esther, you ought to take a risk and go before the king. Now, she's the queen at this point. She's found favor in the eyes of the king. But when she decides to go and ask a favor of the king, here's what she says in Esther chapter 4, verse 16. She says, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa. This is the same capital, same empire. And fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. Thus I will go to the king, here it is, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. I'm about to go and ask a favor. I don't have the right to do that. If I die, I die. This is where Nehemiah is at. He's about to ask something that he shouldn't, in one sense, be asking. There's incredible risk here. But he asks it because he's trusting God. Let's see what happens in Nehemiah chapter 2. Let's go back to it and see what the response is. Pick it up at verse 4. The king said to me, well, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs. Second time he's used that little phrase, by the way, the city of my father's tombs, that I might rebuild it. Now this prayer of Nehemiah, when he says, I prayed, this is not an Artaxerxes, give me a week so that I can answer your question. This is the prayer that every follower of Christ should learn. This is the prayer that goes like this. Help! Help! You know, Nehemiah's very much afraid. And so he shoots up this quick prayer to God, God help! And then he launches in. Now, he's obviously thought about this for 4 months. And he's now taking an incredible step of faith, an incredible risk. And he says, if it please the king, if I have found favor in my sight. And he comes back to this phrase, let me return to the tombs of my fathers. I think he's trying wisely to win the heart of Artaxerxes if he's not already won it, by saying, remember, this is who I am at the core. How can I not be sad even though I get to serve you, O king? Send me that I might rebuild it. It's a simple request that he asked for. And let's see the response of the king. So the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey be and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me. And I gave him a definite answer. Definite answer to what? Definite answer to how long are you going to be gone? When will you come back? And I said to the king, also, verse 7, if it please the king, Let letters be given to me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And let a letter be given to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go. And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was upon me. Nehemiah had this whole plan laid out in his mind. For 4 months he had sought the presence of God. For 4 months he had listened to God. For 4 months he said, what should I do? Do you want to use me? How can I be involved? What's it going to take? I don't know what the dialogue, but for 4 months he sought God about this. And God led him, as God always leads us when we seek his face. When we ask for guidance, he always gives it. And Nehemiah asked, and so for 4 months, God gave him a vision, a plan, an idea, a thought, a perspective on what was necessary. And so he was ready. He was ready. He asked for 3 things. First of all, he told him, this is how long it's going to take. He said, I gave him a definite answer. I think I'll be gone X amount of time. But here's what he was asking for. He's asking for 3 things. Did you catch it? He's asking for freedom from his duties. He's asking for a leave of absence. He's asking to step out of a very important and very trusted position in the empire of Artaxerxes. I want to return. I want to go to Jerusalem. You're going to have to find somebody else. That's the first thing he asked. Second of all, he asked for authorization from the king, because Nehemiah knows if he's going to travel through some places where people are going to wonder, who are you? Where are you going? So he's asking for official letters from the king. He knew he would need that. Give me letters so that when I pass through, there will be safe passage. Third thing he asked for was materials, resources. He said, and give me a final letter for Asaph, the man who keeps your forest, authorizing the use of whatever materials I need, whatever wood can be taken from the king's forest, so that I can rebuild. And then I love how he sums up this little interchange. I love how he sums it up. He says in verse 8, he says, and the king granted this to me because the good hand of my God was upon me. Nehemiah understood what we all should understand. That the Bible from cover to cover is God's story. This is what it is. It's God's story. This is a record of his dealing. Human history is a record of God's dealing. God is a sovereign God over the nation. And Nehemiah knew, just as surely as 2 Chronicles 36 says that God stirred up the heart of Cyrus to issue a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, just as surely Nehemiah knew that God had turned the heart of Artaxerxes, just like he had prayed, no doubt in Proverbs 21:1, had turned his heart to say, okay, Nehemiah, you go. And here's your letters. And here's your materials. And here's your time. And here's your freedom. Because Nehemiah knew that Artaxerxes granted, but God gave. And there's a big difference. Artaxerxes granted, but God gave this event. Reminds me very much of when Jesus stood before Pilate, you remember? And Jesus chose not to answer Pilate's questions about who he was. And Pilate said, don't you understand that you're not answering me? How dare you not answer me? Don't you understand that I have authority to put you to death? That your life is in my hands? Remember Jesus' great response? You have no authority over me, except the authority that's been given you from on high. Nehemiah believed the same thing. Artaxerxes had authority, humanly speaking, but God was sovereign. So what do we do with a chapter of the Bible like this? Let's step back a minute. What are we supposed to learn from this account? This is history. Why did God include all of this history in the Bible? How are we supposed to use it? So what do we do now that we've analyzed this a little bit? Well, I want to take you back to the New Testament for a minute. If you have your Bibles, turn back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, just for a second, because I want to answer that question. It's important for the whole study of Nehemiah. What are we to do with passages like this, history passages? How are we to understand them? Why are they in the Bible? Well, the Bible doesn't leave us in the dark about why they're in the Bible. It tells us why they're in the Bible. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, there's a long description of people that lived in the Old Testament days, like Nehemiah and others, some that were good, some that were bad. And then in verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 10, it says this: now these things happened to people in the Old Testament. These things happened as examples for us so that we would not crave as they also crave. Jump down to verse 11. These things happened to them as an example. Second time it says, what happened in the Old Testament was an example for us. And then it adds these words: and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the end of the ages has come. A lot of the Bible is about the record of this sovereign God dealing with people like us. And we learn people that do well in that relationship, and we learn of people that do badly. And they're examples for us. And we're to learn from their example. That's what this text says. What happened to them happened as an example twice, was written down for us so that we could learn and apply. So what's lesson number one that we should learn from Nehemiah? How did he take action steps that enabled him to build a legacy? If you're following along in your notes, here we go. There are five steps, if you would. That's the first lesson that define what Nehemiah did. There in your notes as lesson number one. Here's what he did. I'll give you step one and step two. First of all, Nehemiah did this. He assessed carefully, he assessed clearly, and he planned carefully. The reason that Nehemiah was used of God, the reason that he could build a legacy, is he understood Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Both those statements are true. Both are ordained by God. God gave you a mind. He called you to use it. Planning and thinking and assessing are not counter to faith. They are part of faith. This is what Nehemiah did. He assessed carefully. What am I going to need to rebuild Jerusalem? What's it going to take? What's the right approach with this powerful king Artaxerxes? How am I going to get this done? What's the plan going to look like? I'm going to need freedom from my job responsibilities. I'm going to need letters of permission. I'm going to need resources. So he's assessing, he's thinking, he's planning. Those are the first two of five steps. Second, the third and fourth step are this. And then he acted courageously and he moved forward decisively. See, if you're going to build a godly legacy, it's not enough to be planning and thinking and assessing and understanding. At some point, you're going to have to say, in the four realms of legacy that we're thinking about in these series, your own character, your family, your calling, your life calling, whatever that may be, your church family where God has called you to be involved. At some point, you stop assessing and stop planning, and you take courage and you move forward decisively. You say, this is what it's going to take. I need to do this for my family, for my character, at my work. And you move forward decisively. This is exactly what Nehemiah did. What a courageous act this was on his part, to go before the king and to risk his very life for the sake of his people, and to move decisively and say, oh, king, grant me permission to go rebuild the city. Oh, king, give me letters, give me materials. Oh, king, let me be gone for X amount of months because this is what I feel God's called me to do. And God granted it to him. And then the fifth step of this first lesson is this: that he trusted God. After he had assessed clearly, planned carefully, acted courageously, moved forward decisively, then he trusted. He took a step of faith and he trusted God. The trust of Nehemiah in God is going to be throughout this book. I want to show it to you in a couple places right back here. Go back to the end of chapter 1, at the end of his prayer, where he's praying, and he says in verse 11, he says, oh God, make your servant successful today. I'm trusting you that when I step into the presence of the king, when the opening comes and I ask for that which is risky, I'm trusting you, God, to make me successful. I see it again in verse 8 here, where he says, the reason that Artaxerxes granted me this It's because God's good hand was upon me. I trusted him. I stepped out in faith, and he was with me. You can see it again in verse 20 at the end of the chapter, in the second little vignette we're going to look at there briefly, where it says, verse 20, I answered them and said, the God of heaven will give us success. Nehemiah is about to lead the beginning of the rebuilding of the wall at the end of this chapter. And he does it by stepping out in faith, and he says, God will give us success. I trust him. People who leave a legacy that honors God, they assess clearly, they plan carefully, they act courageously, they move forward decisively, and through it all they trust God. Lesson number 2. Let's look at the next little vignette that happens, verse 9 and 10. Now I came to the governors of the provinces beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. And the king had sent with me officers of the army and the horsemen. So he passes through without incident because he's got the letters. He also has royal officers from the king's army. Verse 10. But verse 10, when he finally arrives in Jerusalem, when Sanballat the Hornite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. This is probably, maybe, not what Nehemiah expected. I want you to put yourself for a minute in Nehemiah's shoes. He's just come off of this wonderful high of taking a risk, asking help from Artaxerxes and from God, more importantly, and it all falls into place. And suddenly the doors are thrust open. He might have expected that things are going to go smoothly because, hey, I'm walking with God. I'm doing his will. I'm trusting him. If I'm following God, everything's going to work out right? Well, it didn't. He runs smack dab into these unseemly characters, Sanballat and Tobiah, and you're going to hear a lot about them in the rest of the book. And they are quite seemly characters, and they oppose him. They're not at all happy that he's there. Even though they see the king's letter, even though they see the king's officers, they're not at all happy, and they're not at all timid about opposing him. Here's lesson number 2. If you're going to move forward and build a godly legacy, it's this. Expect and don't misinterpret obstacles or opposition. Expect and don't misinterpret obstacles or opposition. Sometimes I think that we think that when we step out in faith to obey God, when we follow, when we make a courageous choice, that everything is going to go very smoothly. And it simply doesn't. It didn't for Nehemiah. It hasn't for many of the people in Scripture. It hasn't for many people in the modern day and age who follow God. Oftentimes following God leads us, to use a phrase, into what feels like a ditch. And Nehemiah probably felt like he'd just run into a ditch when he got there because Sanballat and Tobiah were very powerful officials, and they opposed him right from the get-go. Okay, this is not going to be easy. This is not going to be pain-free. I love if you're ever in the midst of a decision that you have to make that's a significant life decision, and you're wondering, how do I discern the will of God? I've probably recommended this before, but I don't think I've ever read a better chapter in a book about guidance than the chapter in J.I. Packer's book, Knowing God. And it's called Thou Our Guide. Thou Our Guide. It's just a great practical chapter on guidance. If you're facing any kind of decision of significance, I encourage you to pull out this book or get a digital copy or something. It's worth the price of the book just for this chapter, I think. Thou Our Guide. Wonderful wisdom. Here's what Packer says about guidance that lines up with what Nehemiah experienced. He writes, "It does not follow that right guidance will be vindicated by a trouble-free course thereafter. Here is another cause of deep perplexity for Christian people. They have sought God's guidance. They believe it's been given. They set off along the road which God seemed to indicate. And now, as a direct result, they run into a new crop of problems, which otherwise would not have arisen. Isolation, criticism, abandonment by their friends, practical frustrations of all sorts. And at once they grow anxious and they begin to think," Packer says, "that maybe this is a Jonah situation. Maybe I didn't follow God's guidance. Maybe I actually missed it, and therefore I'm in trouble." Packer writes, "That is possible, and the wise person will take occasion from his troubles to check his original guidance carefully. But trouble should always be treated, but trouble is not necessarily a sign of being off track at all. For as the Bible declares in general, there are many afflictions of the righteous. And so it teaches in particular that following God's guidance regularly leads to upsets and distresses which one otherwise would have escaped. He gives a whole bunch of biblical examples, and then he says, and of course, there's the final example and proof of this truth, and it's this: Jesus Christ himself. No human life has ever been so completely guided by God, and no human being has ever qualified so comprehensively for the description of man of sorrows, Jesus. Divine guidance set Jesus at a distance from his family, his fellow townsmen. It brought him into conflict with all the nation's leaders, religious and civil, and it finally led to his arrest and betrayal. What more can we Christians expect while we abide in the will of God? As Jesus said, a student is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. And so Packer summarizes, sooner or later, God's guidance, which brings us out of darkness into light, I know what to do, will also bring us out of light into darkness. Why is all this happening? Expect and don't misinterpret opposition. That's the second lesson of building a legacy that honors God. So those are the two lessons. Now let's see them played out again in the second vignette of this chapter. Let's just quickly walk through vignette number 2. So Nehemiah has arrived, and you're going to see these same two lessons played out. Nehemiah has arrived in Jerusalem, and here's what happens, verse 11. I came to Jerusalem. I was there 3 days. I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So for 3 days, he doesn't tell anybody what do you catch the phrase? What God was putting in my mind. What's he doing? He's assessing carefully. He's assessing clearly. He's planning carefully. How does he do that? Well, let's read and see what he does. Verse 13. So I went at night by the valley gate. Jerusalem was this walled city that had lots of gates. I went at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well onto the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate, the king's pool. It was so bad there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up at night by the ravine. I inspected the wall. I entered the valley gate again and returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. So for the first 3 or 4 days, all Nehemiah does, he repeats his pattern. Assess and plan. Assess and plan. Rides around the wall. God, what do you want me to do? What's needed? By the way, don't you think that whoever named the gates of Jerusalem needs a different job? One of the gates is named the refuse gate, literally the dung gate. Imagine if you're a husband and you come home one day and you say to your wife, honey, I bought us a great little house right next to the dung gate. Location, 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 right? It's not very good. Anyway, the names of the gates in Jerusalem are pretty weird. But so he's assessing, he's planning. Let's see what he does next, verse 17. I said to them, so then I said to them, so now he goes public, verse 17. I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in. Jerusalem is desolate. Its gates are burned by fire. Come, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a reproach. That little phrase is important, that we no longer be a reproach. He's appealing to the honor of God's people. He's saying, in the ancient world, our God is the great God, but his city lies in disrepair, and we are shaming him and us by being in this state. You can almost hear Nehemiah's impassioned speech. Let's rebuild this thing for the honor of our God. Verse 18, I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. And then they said, yes, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. So Nehemiah does the next things. He acts courageously, he moves forward decisively, and he trusts God. Come on, guys, let's build this wall again. Let's restore the honor of our people and of our God. Lesson number 1, lived out all over again. And he trusts God to do that. Lesson number 2 happens again in the next verses, verse 19. When Sanballat, the Hornite, here they are again, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, Geshem, now they had a third one, the Arab, heard it. They mocked us They despised us, and they said, what is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Now they're accusing him of something that could cost him his life. One of many threats that you'll see come. So I answered them and I said, the God of heaven will give us success. I trust him. Therefore, we, his servants, will build and arise, but you have no portion. These guys were not Jewish. But you have no portion or right in this thing. So Nehemiah continues courageously, decisively, clearly, and he stands up against the opposition. He's not overwhelmed by it. He's not surprised by it, and he moves forward. These are the two lessons. If you're going to build a legacy, these two lessons need to mark the multitude of decisions that you face. Let me close with this morning. On April 21st, two people died in America. One that got national news, and it was the lead news story for days. The other one got no national news. One was Prince, the entertainer. And I remember I was sitting in a meeting in Minneapolis when news broke that Prince had died. And of course, it was even bigger, if it could be bigger, in Minneapolis because that was his home. But then we also got word. I was sitting in this Christian meeting with some leaders of the Free Church, our denomination, and word came that the man who had for many years and had been a friend of mine, had been the head of our missions department, Ben Zawatsky, had died. And his wife had died just 2 days earlier. And Ben had actually prayed for years that when the time came for them to go home, that they would, he actually prayed they'd die in a plane crash because he wanted them to die together, but God answered a little bit differently. But they died of natural causes within 2 days of each other. And you could almost see the sweetness of God saying to Ben, who was the head of our missions department, who started ministries all over the world, who was a friend to literally hundreds and hundreds of missionaries and launched many missions careers. You can almost hear the gentle voice of God saying, I'll grant that prayer. I'm going to bring Muriel and I'm going to bring you home almost together. It was a sweet moment. And I couldn't help but think about it all the drive home from Minneapolis that day. Every once in a while, I would take a break and I'd turn on the radio to try and catch what was on the news. But then I'd turn it off because all the news was about Prince. It was about Prince. It was about Prince. There was nothing else on the news. And I got thinking about the different legacies of these two people. And I got thinking about the different welcomes that they received. Now, I don't know a whole lot about Prince. I've never met the man. But from his songs, from what he said, from the lifestyle he lived, there's nothing to indicate that he did anything that would be what a follower of Christ would do. He promoted things that were very, very far from God's will for our world. Yet he gained enormous notoriety, and he left a legacy that is a worldwide legacy. But I think Ben and Muriel left a legacy that is an eternal legacy. They left a legacy that honors God. And I think they received, I don't think. I know they received a very different welcome when they stood in the presence of their Creator. I'm absolutely convinced that they heard, well done, good and faithful servants. And that's what we as Christ followers want to hear. Let's stand and pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for this wonderful book of Nehemiah. Thank you for the truths that are found there. Thank you for the examples that are set before us. I pray that you would help us to live our lives as Nehemiah lived his life. Help us to learn from his example, the way he took hold of your hand and was used by you to leave a legacy that is honoring to you. In your name, amen.